Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, everyone, depending on where you are on the planet. For RRH Consultores, a boutique law firm based in Mexico City, it's a pleasure to organize this session called Beyond Trade Rules, Labor Provisions in Recent RTAs, USMCA, CPTPP, and EU's regional trade agreements. We thank the Geneva Trade Week organizers for making this possible. Today, our panel is composed by the following distinguished speakers that I will briefly introduce in alphabetical order, just highlighting some relevant elements of their CVs. Professor Kathleen Clausen is Associate Professor of Law, University of Miami School of Law. She was Associate General Counsel at the USTR and a Legal Counsel at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. She's member of the roster of panelists for USMCA Chapter 31 Dispute Settlement Panelists. Thank you, Professor Clausen. Professor Kevin Banks is Director of the Center for Law in the Contemporary Workplace, Queen's University. He teaches, researches, and writes about international and Canadian labor and employment law. He's member of the roster of panelists for the CUSMA, or USMCA Chapter 31 Dispute Settlement Panelists. Thank you, Professor Banks, for being here. Samantha Ataide is a partner in RRH Consultores. She was the General Counsel for International Trade of Mexico and the Lawyer of Mexico in the USMCA negotiations and represented Mexico in several international trade and investment disputes. Thank you, Samantha. Labor provisions are not part of the WTO covered agreements. However, WTO members have included labor provisions in their RTAs since the 90s, with the stated aim of creating a level playing field among trading partners. Some recent RTAs have included much more robust labor instruments, potentially undermining the linkage between the labor obligation violation and its impact on international trade. The objective of this session is to analyze the relationship between trade and labor in recent RTAs and the functioning of the dispute settlement mechanisms as they pertain to trade. We pose some questions that will guide the first part of the session, and we are going to start. Which contemporary RTAs include labor provisions subject to dispute settlement mechanisms? Professor Clausen, the WebEx is yours, please.
Well, thank you so much, Hugo, and thank you to your colleagues at RRH Consultores for the generous invitation to be a part of this program. It's a pleasure to be here and to see so many old and new friends. To your question of which contemporary RTAs include labor provisions that are subject to dispute settlement, I thought I would give an overview on just what counts as a labor provision before turning to the various dispute mechanisms that we've seen in place in different RTAs around the world. So first, when we refer to a labor provision, today that term actually encompasses much more than a simple reference, for example, in a preamble or a standalone provision mentioned in a chapter pertaining to some other theme. And these days, what we find is labor provisions typically are rules or principles addressing either minimum working conditions at a particular workplace or in an industry, or addressing relationships between labor and business. So those rules and principles still don't stand alone themselves. They're often accompanied by a larger framework for thinking about trade and labor and the relationship between the two, as well as a mechanism to ensure compliance in some form. So, as I said, these days there's been a change over time to now. When we think of labor provisions, we're talking about much more of a system than we previously did, often with a compliance mechanism. Now, we don't have time today to walk through the history of labor, trade, and dispute settlement, but I'm sure many who are watching will know that this evolution over time has involved models of different sorts, such as conditional or promotional models that sought to incentivize improvements in labor law and international labor law, unilateral tools that would achieve precisely that goal, to today, as I said, more not only larger frameworks for labor and trade, but binding commitments, reciprocal commitments, and often enforceable commitments. That's not to say that we don't still have the former. We still do have conditional, promotional, and unilateral mechanisms for encouraging improvements in labor law. You see this, for example, in the generalized system of preferences used by the United States and by other economies as well. I'll just footnote that I've recently written a book chapter we can say more about later that tries to ask whether that really is the best way to go. That is, moving from unilateral to binding reciprocal chapters, or whether we should revisit the menu of options once again. It's been a pretty steady trend from one to the other, but I suggest that some introspection and reflection to consider what's working and what's not working before we resume business as usual, and future agreements may be worthwhile. So we can talk more about that in the Q&A if you wish. But historically, of course, as you know, and as you pointed out, Ugo, the WTO has been engaged, but not in the way we've seen in RTAs, certainly. Okay, so with that very brief historical overview, let me talk about the present situation. And three different themes come out of our present moment. One is that we see many, many more labor provisions than we used to. The second is that they've grown in scope. And the third is that we see dispute settlement, the topic of your question, more and more, but in various different forms. So let me just give again the landscape for those who aren't totally familiar. When I say there are more of them, what do I mean by that? Well, today, and these are numbers that have been put together principally by the International Labor Organization, they count about 86 RTAs out of a total of almost 300 that have labor provisions. But if we look at it, that's actually more than 100 countries that have included labor somewhere in their agreements. And the leaders in this space are undoubtedly the United States, the EU, Canada, Chile, and increasingly Japan. Now, we look at those in different ways. You can slice and dice the numbers, but the United States and Canada, almost all of their agreements include some sort of labor provision. The EU is high on that list in a good number of them having having labor provisions. Likewise, Chile about 40%, and as I said, increasingly other major economies such as Japan. The non-leaders, if you will, where do we not see labor provisions? Primarily in free trade agreements found in Southern Asia and in the Arab states. But in terms of growth over time, you can see that about two-thirds of our current labor provisions have been introduced since 2008. So increasingly common. You compare to 1995, when only about 7% of trade agreements had labor provisions, to now nearly 30% do. So in 1995, it was just three trade agreements that had labor provisions, to today, as I mentioned, about 86 or so. So from 7% to 30% in 25 years. They tend to be included in agreements between developed and developing countries, so North-South agreements, and about a quarter of them are in South-South agreements. So if you actually look year by year in the data that the ILO has put together, there's not a discernible trend to be able to say that, okay, every year we're increasing proportionally the number of agreements that have labor provisions, but on the total, clearly we see a trend upwards in growth. Okay, so that's just the bare numbers. Now let me turn to their growth in scope. Two primary obligations feature in labor chapters, which are now the primary means by which we see these provisions. Two primary obligations that follow the U.S. lead. U.S. has these provisions in its labor chapters, and now many other countries do as well. The first is a commitment not to derogate from labor laws in an effort to encourage trade and investment. So again, a commitment on the part of the parties to the agreement not to derogate from labor laws that they have in place, their domestic labor laws, in the interest of trade and investment. And the second obligation is a commitment to the effective implementation of International Labor Organization principles. Now, there's some variation on that, and of course, there are a number of different ILO principles that are at play here, and not all states are equally committed to all of them. So we'll leave that there. But generally, you see over time an increased commitment to ILO principles and ensuring that they appear as part of the domestic labor law. So those are the obligations. But as I said at the outset, they rarely stand alone. There's also typically an arrangement for participation with civil society and with the public to be able to receive information about what's happening in the labor world, if you will, of the trading partner. And finally, there is increasingly some sort of dispute settlement mechanism. But the variation that I referred to earlier is greatest in those latter two areas, the way that the arrangements are set up for civil society to participate, as well as the mechanisms for dispute settlement. Now, not to be forgotten, there are labor provisions increasingly in other chapters as well of many free trade agreements, such as rules of origin and some cooperation chapters with an emphasis on capacity building. And in the case of Canada and Japan, an emphasis as well on labor in investment chapters. But on that point of capacity building, I'll just take a moment to say that although we're focused very much in our conversation today on the particulars of the dispute settlement provisions, there's much, much more to these chapters and to the frameworks that they create than just that relationship that could be adversarial in dispute settlement. That is to say that, especially in the United States, these chapters have been vehicles for creating cooperative relationships from the U.S. side, maybe even sort of managerial relationships to work with the trading partner to set up more mechanisms in country for improving labor law enforcement and other means of improving labor conditions. So that's a pretty rosy view on the relationship, but nevertheless, the emphasis really is just to say that it is much more on building a labor conversation than it is simply, okay, sort of a gotcha relationship in dispute settlement. So there's always a threat of dispute settlement, or at least there has been in the U.S. experience, but there is also a long-standing relationship between labor ministries or trade ministries on the issue. Of course, that threat became a little less threatening with the outcome of the only dispute settlement, completed dispute settlement case we've had on labor, which is the United States-Guatemala case. But I'll come back to that in a moment. The last thing to say is that one thing that's achieved, I think also particularly through the U.S. Agreements, is something that some folks have referred to as a pre-ratification conditionality. That is, prior to the entry into force of an agreement, requiring the trading partner to meet certain benchmarks. And you saw that very much in the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement in an annex referring to Mexico's labor situation. Okay, so to dispute settlement, the majority of these agreements that I've referred to still do not have a dispute settlement, unlike the practice that in the countries that I've mentioned that are the leaders, the United States in particular, and Canada and others. So the dispute settlement chapters can either be specific dispute settlement for labor, or they might connect the labor chapter to dispute settlement state to state, the normal dispute settlement mechanism that's used for the other commitments in the trade agreement. But the styles really depend, and they run a spectrum from consultations to a dedicated review panel to some ordinary arbitration, some that involve labor experts. So there is a range. Likewise, there is a range in sanctions. So if you look at the Canadian agreements, you see mostly monetary assessments. The United States has a mix. Some of the older agreements use monetary assessments. The more recent ones impose trade sanctions, potentially. CPTPP, you saw both on the Canada and Japanese side, suspension of trade benefits now introduced. And the EU sort of standing as an outlier, I think, in this conversation, having almost no sanctions in its trade agreements when it comes to labor, and a number of calls from commentators within the EU for reform on that note. So generally, the issue of dispute settlement and this variation I've just described, particularly with respect to the sanctions, I think that continues to be the most heavily debated aspect of the trade agreement and labor conversation, especially so in the United States. And as I mentioned, that issue being an issue has been driven most recently by the only completed traditional dispute settlement case that we have, the U.S. Guatemala case, which prompted significant outcry in the United States and led to a detailed discussion about whether the state-to-state model or the current commitments that we see in U.S. trade agreements were the best. So that was the backdrop going into the United States, Mexico, Canada negotiations, particularly as they relate to Mexico. And so Mexico then in the spotlight, what we got in the United States was sort of the right political alignments to develop a new labor enforcement mechanism, one that goes, I would say, much farther than any of the ones I've just described. So let me just highlight that then before closing. The USMCA has a feature called the Rapid Response Labor Mechanism. As I mentioned, it's a novel compliance tool that it's in addition to the traditional adjudicatory mechanism for disputes about the application of the labor chapter. It's a unilateral means for any of the parties to seek to force an individual work site in the territory of another party to comply with domestic labor law. So it's incredibly involved. I'll just give you a few of the highlights. As I mentioned, it's intended to handle the specific denial of the right of free association and collective bargaining by a private entity. So although it still turns on engagement between the governments, between two governments, and it involves the use of an arbitral panel, it's far more incident specific than the traditional adjudicatory labor compliance mechanisms. So the panel is comprised of labor experts, and it's not charged with determining whether the government breached the agreement, but rather it's charged with determining whether workers are being denied their rights at a particular place. So it's activated when one of the state parties has a good faith belief that a violation of collective bargaining rights is occurring at a so-called covered facility, which is in a priority sector in the territory of the other party. And I'm using here a number of the terms of art from the text of the agreement, although a number of them lack definition, so is why we won't go into them in great detail here. Once that panel has been formed to investigate this situation at a work site, then it's a matter of days for completing what's known as a verification. So very quickly a panel is formed, but from the moment that the other government is notified, already the complaining state is entitled to a delay of final settlement, meaning it can stop goods at the border. In U.S. customs law, this is known as a liquidation process. It can stop the entry of goods from that work site until the dispute over the labor situation at that worksite has been resolved. So as I said, then the panel does something called a verification, which seems to suggest it goes to the worksite, investigates it, and if it finds a problem, then the complaining party can choose a remedy, which then might include suspending preferential tariff treatment with respect to the goods made at that worksite, or other penalties, including denying entry finally and for good. So in trying to determine just how rapid it is, it says, as I said, it's called the rapid response mechanism. It's a bit challenging to put together a timeline, but in this very quick overview, what I will say is it looks like it's possible to move through the entire process in about 4 months if you take a reasonably generous count. So that's an overview of the latest innovation in dispute settlement, and I'll conclude by and pass the floor back to the team with just a final word, if I may. That is to say that as international lawyers it's easy to focus on these mechanisms and their particularities, their innovations and their potential. But I suspect, like much of the future of trade law, the emphasis in the discussion about trade and labor is going to be much more focused domestically than it has been. That is to say that while these measures are all intended to protect domestic labor in some respects in major northern economies, as much as it is intended to protect international labor in varying degrees, I think the political climate in a number of countries is forcing attention inward, and that may mean the debate over trade and labor again shifts to be somewhat less about trading partners and more about internal systems for supporting workers at home. Hugo?
Thank you, Professor Clausen, for this comprehensive and rapid explanation about trends, specifically on dispute settlement. Samantha, what is your view regarding this question, please?
Thank you, Hugo. I concur with Kathleen on this trend. Although labor provisions have been included in RTIs since the 90s, we are starting to see a more pronounced trend in new RTAs, but with different approaches. Kathleen already mentioned the ILO numbers on RTAs that include labor provisions. Out of those numbers, 50% include a G7 country as a trading partner. But this policy is starting to become also a trend in non-G7 economies. While RTIs concluded by the United States and Canada include strong labor commitments and subject those commitments to dispute settlement mechanisms, we see a different approach in the RTAs concluded by the EU or the EFTA states, that they tend to look for a more active role of unions, stakeholders, NGOs, or civil society in general when it comes to monitoring compliance of labor commitments of the EU trading partners. These RTIs also privilege dialogue. In the Asia-Pacific region, we see RTIs with a comprehensive labor provisions in countries that have negotiated either with the US, Canada, or the EU. Others have more soft law legal instruments that focus more on cooperation. Either way, or regardless the approach followed in each of these RTAs, the implementation could be burdensome for developing countries participating in such RTAs, and we'll probably see an active use of the cooperation, the dialogue, and the dispute settlement mechanisms that Kathleen was already mentioned. Now, talking about contemporary RTAs, the USMCA recently concluded between the United States, Canada, and Mexico also include new features in terms of substantive obligations and dispute settlement. Kathleen already described in terms of regarding dispute settlement the rapid response mechanism, but also in terms of substantive commitments, we also see that the USMCA includes the prohibition of importing goods from other sources that are produced in whole or in part by forced or compulsory labor, including forced or compulsory child labors. We also see provisions on migrant workers and specific provisions against employment discrimination or violence against workers. It is early to say whether the USMCA's model will set a precedent for other trade agreements, and this agreement, alongside with other trade agreements such as the CPTPP or the CETA, have yet to be tested. I will stop my comment here and pass you the floor.
Thank you, Samantha. As for our next question, I know that Professor Banks have made some pertinent research about this. So the next question is, what should be the minimum standard for labor provisions in an RTA? Professor Banks, please.
Great. Thank you, and thanks. I echo Kathleen's thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to present to you this morning. So in answer to Hugo's question, I'm going to develop a way to think about the question rather than provide a single answer. I think the answer is actually quite context specific. It depends to a great degree on the social norms and values of the member states to a regional trade agreement. So my plan for today is to briefly review the state of the art and the trajectory of labor provisions in North America to capture the sense in which these agreements have moved. Though thanks to Kathleen's presentation, I will be very brief. And that will permit me to propose a theory of the purposes of these agreements. And from there, we can talk about some implications for their minimum content. I think the theory accounts reasonably well for the kinds of provisions that we see and the variation across regions. And then some brief thoughts looking ahead. So the current state of the art in North America is largely represented by the Canada-US-Mexico or US-Mexico-Canada agreement, depending on which side of the border you're on. Kathleen has outlined, I think, the essential content of those agreements. I'll just draw your attention to a couple of things. So there is both a commitment to adopt and maintain in national laws the rights that are stated in the ILO Declaration. Now, there's some ambiguity in that statement. I don't think that it entails that the parties have committed to all of the details that have been elaborated in international labor law under the conventions that set out the core rights of the ILO. But clearly, the ILO Declaration is a constitutional obligation of ILO member states, and it has some content. And so this is a commitment to international norms. But as you can see, there are also commitments to acceptable conditions of work with respect to minimum wages, hours of work, and occupational safety and health. There's not a lot of detail at the international level with respect to those things. And I think it's fair to say that these reflect the views of the parties to the agreement with respect to additional labor rights that are important, and a commitment to pursue those. So I'll move to the next slide. There are a range of different compliance mechanisms used. They're both promotional and used to kind of leverage the influence of the states in relation to each other, and enforcement procedures. So there's access to a public submissions procedure so that civil society groups, unions, others who are concerned about labor rights can bring issues of concern to the attention of the state's parties. And there are mechanisms that within each state require them to take up those submissions and investigate them. There is a very detailed international cooperation agenda. Kathleen did a good job of describing the US approach to that. I, at one time, managed the Canadian approach to international cooperation, and I can echo the view that this is a big part of what these agreements are about. In addition, there are, of course, enforcement mechanisms, including the new rapid response labor mechanism. And finally, there's an element of conditionality in that there's an annex requiring a set of reforms on Mexico's part, and stating that the entry into force of the agreement may be conditional on completing those reforms. So the trajectory over the years has been towards increasingly detailed substantive obligations. And I don't have time to review the history either, but I think it's fair to say that we've moved a long way in North America towards concrete obligations with respect in particular to ILO principles and rights. There's been a move, I think almost a complete move towards a parity of treatment with respect to enforcement of labor obligations and other trade agreement obligations, something that wasn't present in early North American agreements. And then finally, the development of special procedures, the rapid review labor mechanism being the most notable in response to systemic challenges that have been observed and worked on over the years. Okay, so how to understand all of this and maybe to think about what we're trying to accomplish with labor agreements and why we see as much variation as we do internationally. Now, I think the best way to understand what these agreements are about is to understand them as an effort to create an international fabric of basic social norms for the traded economy. It's also important to remember that I think the drive to create that fabric comes out of national politics and social life. And so it's not surprising that you're going to see variations internationally. Now, this argument is different from the argument that used to circulate about 20 years ago and that had, I think, was rightly criticized as being impossible to work with. The argument that what trade should try to do is create a level playing field, which takes into account all government measures and policies in order to make sure that there's complete fairness in trade. That's not what this is about. This is about identifying particular norms that matter to the political and social legitimacy of the traded economy and creating a bridge between economies that reflect those norms. So to understand why countries would do that, I'll make a few kind of basic points. All societies set some ground rules for economic activity and competition to ensure that it doesn't undermine their values and institutions. These are articulated in a finite set of fields of law that govern both production processes and product liability. And they're expressed in national laws, but they exist independently of them. Labor laws in particular enact norms that societies consider to be basic norms of decency, respect for freedom and worker dignity, and distributive justice at work. And they're not just there to protect workers, they're also to protect norm-abiding businesses from being undercut and to prevent norm breakers from unjustly benefiting. Now, labor laws are particularly high on the list of these kinds of national norms because they have widespread impacts on conditions of competition and on the lives of people who are governed by trade agreements. Labor costs are a big part of production costs. A big part of producing for international trade is hiring and is employing workers and putting them to work. And so their working conditions are an important part of the social relations and therefore of production that go into trade. And not surprisingly, to the extent that people are worried about the ground rules for economic competition, they think about labor law issues. So they're part of the fabric of social norms that underpin the social and political legitimacy of economic systems, including their traded aspects. So in that light, you can look at an RTA labor provision and see that it does two things. In a way, what it does is it creates a bridge between different social systems, different legal systems, different political systems, to ensure that, if let's say from the Canadian perspective, traded goods entering and circulating within the Canadian economy and causing economic benefits and harms to accrue, as all competition does, is not effectively exempt from those norms. So what the agreement does is it says, we're not, obviously we're not going to agree that all goods have to abide by every Canadian law, but here is a list of principles and rights that we'll all agree to abide by, and that will set the ground rules for our regional trading agreement. To some extent, I think these agreements also protect the capacity of states in the face of growing international competitive pressure to make their own rules and thereby secure their own autonomy. Though, as I've argued in an earlier paper, I think that's more of an issue for developing countries, somewhat ironically, than it is for advanced industrial economies. Okay, so Kathleen alluded to the current context. Here's a slide that I think captures some of the reasons for the political salience of these issues in countries like Canada and the United States. This is a graph that Branko Milanovic presented in his 2016 book, showing the relative gain in real per capita income by global income level over the 20-year period between 1988 and 2008. And I think what that shows is that there have been very big gains for those in the middle of the global income distribution and very big gains at the highest end of the income distribution. But the Canadian middle class, and I think the same is true in the United States, and especially the lower middle class, is located at the bottom of that, at the 80th percentile there, where there have been essentially no gains. And so it's not surprising in this context that we've seen a kind of renewed emphasis on questions about the political and social legitimacy of the global economy. And to the extent that those questions can be addressed through labor chapters, I think it's not surprising that you see big advances in the extent of obligations and the nature of the mechanisms that are used to implement them in response to this growing discontent in countries like Canada and the US. Okay, so that's my view of the broad purposes. So then the next question is, well, what exactly do labor chapters do in relation to those purposes? And here I've listed 3 ways of looking at the approach or the function of labor chapters to realizing those purposes. They're sort of listed in order of increasing ambition. So the first is simply reactive. A labor chapter could be seen as prohibiting and remedying breaches of those ground rules of fair conditions of competition. The second approach, less reactive, is to say, no, that the purpose of the chapter goes beyond that. It's to try and reduce the systemic risks to fair competition, fair conditions of competition, to the ground rules. Recognizing that, in fact, when we deepen and stabilize our trading relationships, we're deepening all of the dynamics of globalization that have led to some of the controversial outcomes that I highlighted earlier. And so in response, we are going to regulate the traded sector as a whole and get proactive about dealing with labor standards in the free trade area. A third approach is to say, even beyond that, it's a precondition for our trading relationship that it have a social dimension to it. That in order to politically to accept both the gains and the disruptions that come with a trading relationship, the disruptions tend to be a lot more focused on particular individuals and businesses than the gains, which are more widely distributed. We're going to create a fairness framework that sets out some basic ground rules. Again, if this is the way that things are going, the focus of the agreement will be on the traded sector as a whole and not simply on remedying particular breaches of fair conditions of competition. And that agreement could be deepened if one adds sustainable economic and social development to the goals, as well as simply protecting labor rights. Okay, so this is a good way of looking at things. It has some implications for the minimum content of regional trade agreements. The first implication is that the normative content is likely to include but extend beyond ILO core labor standards, since the origin of the social norms and the impetus for these agreements lies in national views of what the ground rules for economic activity ought to be. And what the agreements are really doing is reconciling national views in a way that all the parties can live with. The second implication is that the extent of obligations may reach beyond breaches that are proven to affect conditions of competition or other aspects of trade, and may cover traded sectors in their entirety without regard to trade effects. And I think we've seen a move in that direction with the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. And so I think the establishment of that agreement invites a kind of rethinking of what the whole approach is, and that maybe the time has come for that, to think about what are we actually trying to accomplish with our trade agreements. The third thing is that social partner participation matters for labor provisions, just as it does within the domestic context. If this is an extension of the way in which we elaborate and apply the ground norms for economic activity, employers, unions, civil society actors are going to want to be involved, and it would seem legitimate that they be involved. And then finally, I think it's likely that we're going to see rising benchmarks for effectiveness of compliance and enforcement procedures. What we've had is a kind of trajectory of experimentation with different ways of making agreements effective, and the importance of these norms invites reflection on what's working and how things could be done better. So just a few thoughts before I close on that question. The first point I'd like to make, I guess, is that improving labor laws and compliance and enforcement with labor laws involves complex systemic change. It's not, you can usefully contrast it with say a traditional trade law problem of imposition of tariffs that are contrary to the tariff schedule, or subsidization that's contrary to international obligations. In those cases, what's required is the removal of a particular government measure. Here, what's required is often sustained systemic change led by the state. And it requires a sustained commitment of policy, of resources, and deliberation, and often political negotiation at the national level. So it's complex. And I've written a long article, which is listed in the references at the end of this PowerPoint, thinking about that, asking whether international adjudication, the traditional mechanisms, are really up to that task. I think it's helpful, don't get me wrong. I think any agreement requires some backstopping, and having an enforcement procedure is important and necessary. But anyone who's been involved in litigation, I've practiced law, I've negotiated, I've litigated cases, knows that litigation tends to generate a zero-sum logic. And so that the parties stop cooperating once they get to the litigation stage of their dispute. And that's not necessarily a problem if they're going to comply with an order at the end of it, and the compliance is relatively straightforward to monitor. But we've seen, for example, in the studies of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, that once an executive branch becomes reluctant, and it may well become reluctant in the course of litigating a case, they tend to avoid deeper compliance and engage in relatively superficial compliance. So you may get some way towards a solution as a result of a remedy being ordered, but not right away, and perhaps not at all. The other thing to keep in mind is that you might say, well, outside of the litigation process, there is a political process, and litigation might influence political actors, and that could lead to political change and social change. But studies have also shown that the very characteristics that give adjudication its legitimacy reduce its capacity to mobilize domestic political constituencies. Now, fact-finding is a very painstaking process, very tedious process. It doesn't generate good sound bites. And legal analysis also tends to be very precise. Distinctions have to be drawn, and again, don't lead very well to mobilizing the sound bites. So at the end of the day, I think there may be a possibility that relying too much on adjudication leaves the trade sanction mechanism overloaded. Trade sanctions are not asked to do that much in trade law. The famous aphorism, I think it was Robert Hudak who said that the sanctions are the punch that hits no one, because they are so seldom used. And I think that reflects, in some ways, that the problems that trade law has traditionally confronted are easier problems than, or at least were until recent decades. And we can, not recent decades, but in the last couple of years, and we can talk about that. So what might we do to improve effectiveness? I think the rapid response labor mechanism is an interesting innovation. It may incentivize private actors to comply. Of course, it needs to be worked out, and people need to ensure that it operates fairly, but that may reach beyond the state actors and directly into the private sector. Another approach that I outlined, and I think there's an interesting point of commonality here with things that Kathleen was saying in her presentation about maybe needing to rethink whether the tariff preference system had something more to offer. Another approach might be to say, look, let's agree ahead of time with respect to what needs to get done in order to improve labor standards. And we'll do this in an iterative fashion. And we'll do it within the context of an overall framework agreement. And we'll use proactive monitoring and regular meetings in order to ensure that things are moving in the right direction. We'll engage employers and unions in the process and even in the monitoring. And we'll hold out an incentive to make to assure that the parties are all aligned. I think there's a good example of this in the US-Cambodia Textiles Agreement. To some extent, we see it also reflected in consistency plans, though those tend to be more of a one-time approach to securing systemic change rather than an iterative one. So it may be that that's where we end up going in the longer term. So if you're looking ahead as to what the minimum standard might be, I suspect at maybe not in the next 2 or 3 years, maybe even not in the next decade, but sooner or later, we're going to be heading down that path. And so I will stop there and thank you once again for your time and attention.
Thank you, Professor Banks, in particular for also providing the sources. I think the last slide, where those willing to learn and go deeper can use those sources. A lot of food for thought. Going to our last question of this part of the session, I also remind people that in the second part of the session, we'll be receiving questions. I think we have some elements to further reflect, so don't be shy. Send the questions through the chat. Okay, the third question is, should the WTO start discussing and addressing trade and labor matters? Professor Banks, what are your views?
So someday, I personally would like to see that happen, but for all of the reasons that I outlined in my presentation, but probably not now. There are two reasons I say that. One, the multilateral system, which is very important to the well-being of states around the world, is under a lot of strain at the moment. And secondly, I think before moving to put labor standards on the agenda of the WTO, there needs to be wider acceptance. So I think we're on a path now where states that accept these principles are negotiating them into regional trade agreements. We're developing experience with that approach. I think that experience over time will reassure countries that this is not a device for disguised protectionism, that it is actually about what it says it's about. And so I would say, it's premature to put this on the agenda, in my personal opinion.
Thank you, Professor. I will provide my own opinion on this. Since 1996, the Singapore Ministerial Declaration refers to labor matters, indicating just that ILO is a competent body to set and deal with these standards. And also, but members said that they were rejecting the use of labor standards for protectionist purposes. And they noted that the WTO and ILO secretariats will continue their existing collaboration, and it also was reaffirmed in the 2001 Doha Ministerial Declaration. I will provide my own view, taking advantage that I have the floor. As for whether the WTO should deal with this issue, I consider some similar lines that Professor Kevin Banks said. I consider that two aspects should be considered. First, the timing. For those that are familiar with the WTO, I don't have to further explain that the negotiating pillar right now is not ready to take a new task. First, some issues should be resolved before considering new tasks. And second, the need. The economic integration is synonymous with falling barriers to commercial exchange. The example of the North American region could not be extrapolated or imported into the WTO. The North American region is a highly integrated one, and there are many factors that affect competition, and any minor factor could be relevant. There are no tariffs in the region. There are few barriers, depending on when we look at. But the factor markets such as capital was regulated by NAFTA, which was partially designed to facilitate capital flows. However, labor flows were specifically excluded from the main agreement. It's more common that the need would become from integrated markets. While there are still barriers, the main goal will be removing those barriers. So I think that for the time, in the current circumstances, the matter of trade and labor will be regulated by RTAs, as was explained. Just I leave some questions open. Can WTO members can take trade actions to impose labor standards or discriminate between countries with low labor standards? Professor Clausen, what is your view on this question?
Thanks, Hugo. It's not too different from the views that have already been expressed by you and by Kevin. The question, the way you framed it was, should the WTO start discussing and addressing? There's a big difference between those two things. So discussing may be within reach, although I'm not sure I'd put it too high on the agenda right now, given the other challenges that you both have identified. Addressing, I was taking that more to ask whether we could foresee the possibility of a WTO agreement that would do what FTA agreements have, what FTAs have done, and that, historically, of course, if you look way back at the Havana Charter, we did see the prospect of some labor provisions there. But as you pointed out, Hugo, the 1996, what I sort of see as a decoupling comment, although invoked in later decisions and later ministerials, I think that really pushed the conversation elsewhere, out to the FTAs, and may have exacerbated some of the larger issues with misalignment between trade and labor. I also think that the very helpful shift in normative frame that Kevin described at the outset of his remarks makes this extremely difficult. That is, these varying views on what the future direction should look like, and the way that at least some economies have shifted their view on what's important in this space. And finally, it's quite hard for me to imagine from a dispute settlement perspective how this would go down. Apart from the problems with making new rules right now at the WTO, I think we would also have a number of evidentiary problems. FTAs themselves may not be equipped, but the WTO even less so, to handle issues of labor disputes from the moment of a panel request, what that would look like, the accommodation of anonymous evidence, accommodation of what could be some sort of mass claim that's quite different from the typical measure that the WTO deals with, trying to reach a timely outcome. So those are just a few of the sort of procedural challenges that I think would be faced in a more traditional WTO setting for the typical labor dispute that we see.
Thank you, Professor Clausen. Now I will pass the floor to Samantha. Please.
Thank you, Hugo. I also agree with you. Right now, labor issues and their impact on trade are discussed in a very general manner within the WTO. As you mentioned, Hugo, the 1996 declaration and later the 2001 ministerial declaration, the members set out their position about labor standards and how that discussion should remain within the context of ILO. Therefore, for the WTO to start really discussing labor matters, it will depend on the WTO members to decide on this. But right now we're seeing that there are some developed members that believe that at least certain labor issues should be considered by the WTO. But this is highly controversial, and I agree with you. I'm not sure if right now the organization has a lot on its plate to pursue that discussion. However, I do consider very relevant a close monitoring of RTAs with labor provisions in the context of the Committee on Regional Trade Agreements, particularly how certain provisions fit in the context of the WTO cover agreements. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for your thoughts and comments that are very relevant for the next part of the session. My colleague Samantha will moderate this part, We also received some of your questions, and we'll also pose some questions to you, the audience. Please, Samantha.
Thank you, Hugo. For this part of the session, first, we are posting in this moment a quick poll for all the attendees, and we kindly ask if you can take 5 minutes to answer the poll. So while participants take their time to answer the poll, I would like to draw to my colleagues their attention to some of the questions that are already posted in the Q&As, so you can start reflecting on those questions and we can address them later. We have 3 questions right now, one from Sarah, one from Grace, and one from Bishwa.
There are still 1 minute and a half for those that have replied the poll can make some further questions.
Okay, time is up. Thank you. For those who answered the poll, can we see the result? Let me check. Okay, our first question, we ask our audience, should RTAs tackle extensively labor matters? And we see that the majority answer yes, but in a limited way. For our second question, it was, should trade and labor be separate matters? And we see a split opinions between question answer A, no, and C, yes. And for our last question, should the WTO start to discuss or negotiate labor provisions? We see also opinions on yes, but in the medium future, or yes, but in the long distant future. So, in line with these questions, I have additional questions for our speakers, and I will also welcome our audience to continue posting your questions that we'll be addressing during this second part of the session. And I would like to start with Kevin. Professor Banks, are labor matters the new reason to impose trade barriers?
Okay, thank you. I don't think they are. I think that labor chapters, both in their aims and their effects, are not protectionist and don't provide a good vehicle for disguised protectionism. So I'll explain why I say that. First of all, the wording of labor chapters is precise. It's focused on labor issues, and it's not easily manipulated in the way that perhaps some other provisions, say national security, for example, can be expanded and stretched and used to cover protectionism. Secondly, the procedures that are used to adjudicate claims of labor standards violations are demanding and fair and require that the violation be proven. Third, in the experience under labor chapters, I think any review of that experience would find that most of it has focused on cooperatively resolving differences, working through international assistance, trying to negotiate solutions. We've only had one case that has proceeded to adjudication in the entire history of these chapters. So I don't think the experience lends any credence to the idea that labor chapters are going to be used for protectionist purposes. Fourthly, I think it's relatively hard to get a political consensus on a protectionist basis to use a labor chapter. If the constituency for protectionism includes the employer community, the business community, I suspect that in most countries, the business community would rather use some other vehicle than a labor standards complaint if it wants to pursue protectionist aims. And then finally, labor standards themselves don't really take away much of the international cost advantage that low-cost countries have. Labor standards account for a pretty small fraction. Most of the low labor cost advantage is due to plain old supply and demand issues. Implementing labor standards isn't going to change that. So, I'm reminded of an excerpt in the congressional records that I read when I was researching my doctoral dissertation, where a Congress and Industrial Organizations organizer, a union organizer in the US, was being asked in front of a Senate committee, what do your members think about this proposal for a fair labor standards chapter in the International Trade Organization Charter, the one that Kathleen referred to earlier? And he said, well, it's a tough sell, because they realize that it's not going to protect them against job loss. And that's what they're most worried about. So for all of those reasons, I don't think that labor chapters are a reason to impose protectionist trade barriers.
Thank you, Professor Banks. And now that you have the floor, I would like to move to a question that is addressed to you by Nicolas Diaz. And Nicolas is asking, considering the approach you took on the broad objectives of labor rules in TFAs, should be more direct involvement of the international organizations like ILO or OECD? Should there be an international effort to create an international trade standard? Could there be a double standard, one for internal labor markets and another for labor markets directly depending on international trade?
So it's a great question. I would like to see more involvement by the ILO, but it's also true that the ILO can only do what its members are willing to have it do. So there needs to be a gradual process of building support for the international bridge. I think what the questioner is asking is, given that the impetus for these agreements comes out of national politics, shouldn't we be trying to create more of an international bridge so there's more consistency internationally? And it's a difficult problem to solve. Yes, ideally, but someone has to lead in the process of developing that international consensus. And I think inevitably it means that countries like the United States and Canada will be playing that role for a while. But I would like to see the OECD and the ILO join and attempt to create some international uniformity as their member states are ready for that.
Thank you, Professor Banks. I had two more questions for you, but I'm looking at the time and we have 15 more minutes, so I would like to go directly to the questions from the audience. So our first question is from Sarah Asher. Sorry if I don't pronounce the last names correctly. And Sarah is asking the following question. What could be good incentives to encourage developing countries to adopt labor provisions in FTAs? And I open the floor to all of you.
Let me start by saying, or kick off the discussion by saying, I think tariff preferences actually work pretty well. The incentives in a traditional trade agreement are simply the threat of withdrawal of benefits, but we might explore things like enhanced benefits for enhanced commitments to deepening labor standards to provide a positive incentive.
I had some of the same thoughts as Kevin, that the trend seems to be that there's proliferation, right? So that with more outreach and engagement, these take hold. But I could see it becoming a requirement for an access to sort of GSP or other programs, both a carrot and a stick approach here, or to be able to access a higher level, so to speak, RTA. You must first use it with regional partners, plus continued engagement, access to capacity building, money talks, and among other training opportunities. So plus, last thing I'll just say is I think there's probably a signaling factor that a country gets out of doing that may attract attention from, again, more attractive economies as well.
Thank you. Hugo, do you have any comments?
Yeah, a quick comment. There are positive incentives and also deterrent incentives. As someone mentioned, the GSP, for example, there were some withdrawals to Thailand or to another country, Cambodia, as for the EU within the EU framework. And that's the deterrent. But a positive incentive is societies are more aware and conscious about what is happening. What they are buying is complying with certain standards. So they are worried about labor provisions outside of the market. So I think this would be a positive incentive in order to promote products under certain conditions.
Thank you. We have also a question from Grace Beaumont to all the panelists. Grace is asking the panelists' views on the increasing trend to include explicit provision which address gender-related issues in the field of labor, employment, and whether these provisions do or have the potential to lead to better outcomes for women workers. I will start with Kathleen, perhaps.
Sure. I will leave the potential effects part of that question to the experts who are tracking data in that space. But I would just say that the gender provision in the USMCA it has a particularly interesting history and sort of positioning in U.S. politics that might have gone unnoticed. That is to say, typically, right, the United States is rule-making rather than rule-taking, but there's some suggestion that that might have not been the case this time, and you compare what happened in USMCA with what has been, at least in this administration, some policies that appear to be in conflict or in tension. And I recommend an article in the Yale Law Journal Forum published, I think, last year, or earlier this year by Jean Galbraith and Beatrix Liu, called Gender Identity, Protection, Trade, and the Trump Administration, A Tale of Reluctant Progressivism. I'm happy to share that, but you can find it online on the Yale Law Journal website that really tracks exactly that trend that I just described.
Thank you, Professor Banks.
Yeah, just briefly. I think what we saw in the USMCA on gender issues reflects a change in the social norms in this country. I think the lead on that probably came from the Canadian government. And so it's another example of how these provisions evolve in response to norms that bubble up from the national level.
Okay, thank you, Professor Banks. I agree with you, and you can see the specifically gender provisions on the discrimination article. So I also consider that the more these new RTAs are starting to consider gender issues, that will also become better outcomes for women workers. But right now I see that it's early to make an assessment, and probably RTAs need a better provisions towards gender. We also saw that in the context of some negotiations, there were proposals for a specific gender chapters that will tackle a variety of issues related to gender. But those chapters in some agreements were reflected in or spread out in different chapters rather than having a gender chapter. And in other agreements, we see that those chapters are becoming a single chapter, but with sub provisions. So we need to see more binding provisions on that area. So I will move to another question from Vishwa. And the question is, with respect to developing countries, modifying labor laws may increase the cost of production, not to speak of the social cost resulting from the resulting layoffs, unless this is balanced by technological upgradation, which also has a cost. The question is, the balancing also has its limits. Is it prudent to still go ahead with the reforms irrespective of the consequences? And I probably will start with Professor Banks.
Okay, well, I think it's the answer to that will depend from country to country. I think the goal within a regional trade agreement is to provide a basic set of norms that apply to everybody. And if it's effective, if the agreement is effective in generating that outcome, then you don't lose out in competition within the regional trade agreement by complying with labor standards. So there shouldn't be layoffs. There may be technological upgrading if the costs of labor go up a little bit and you need to make work more productive to make the wage bill cost effective. But the real question is, well, how much do you face competition from outside of the trading bloc? Are the advantages that you gain through enhanced market access within the trading bloc greater than the risks that you face by being undercut from competitors outside? I guess the other thing to remember, though, is that a lot of the industries where labor cost competition is most cutthroat are a little bit of a dead end anyways. There isn't a clear path out of that mode of production into higher levels of development. So those are my very high level thoughts.
Thank you. Quick comments from Kathleen or Hugo before we start wrapping up our session.
Just very quick, that there are also positive collateral consequences of labor provisions, like to high or increase the standards within a country. The risk that Professor Banks mentioned, I think, should be considered in light of whether to increase or adapt new labor standards, or being in a situation where cuts or some limitations could be imposed that will be very not in benefit of that country.
Thank you, Hugo. And one quick question from our dear friend Ricardo Ramirez. And Mr. Ramirez is asking, do you think the USMCA will become the new labor template for RTAs? How do you avoid the rapid response mechanism becoming a new tool for protectionism by undermining the standard in a manner affecting trade? Are we converting a trade agreement into a purely labor instrument? And I will ask for your quick comments on this question.
Okay, I'll start. Thanks so much, Ricardo, for the questions. I'm going to answer from a U.S. perspective only, and I mentioned earlier the EU template and what's happening there. We didn't mention the EU-Korea dispute, which is the other ongoing dispute in under a sustainable development, the chapter, the EU equivalent of the labor chapter, which has a hearing next week and has had a change in chair and now is moving forward. So that will be another section to watch. But for USMCA, for the United States, USMCA certainly is the focal point. And I think my short answer is that it partly depends on November. And I don't mean just the White House, but I mean also Congress, because so much of this is politically determined. It's hard for me to say that we would see a rapid response mechanism of the sort of USMCA in the currently negotiated agreements, that is the potential agreement with Kenya and the agreement with the United Kingdom. I don't think those are quite the trading partners for which that mechanism is appropriate or would be expected, but maybe some of the other innovations in the chapter will be preserved, at least the ones where the United States was the primary promoter rather than maybe the Canadians, as we just heard. And so maybe we will see something like this again. I think that is possible. We rarely go back in U.S. trade agreements in terms of labor and environment. We usually just add, but it does depend, I think, very much on a trading partner and politics. So that's the short answer there. I'm going to punt on the second question, which is a great question, but I'm going to skip then to the third in the interest of time, as to converting the trade agreement into a labor instrument. Well, I would not have referred to the manner affecting trade footnote as being the reason that might be the case, but much more the rapid response mechanism is very much a labor-only mechanism, and so the footnote to manner affecting trade, to which Ricardo refers, I think is the least offensive part of the question. That is to say that there's still a trade agreement around that labor chapter in that language. So I'd be surprised, nevertheless, to see a state-to-state dispute on labor, given the presence of the rapid response mechanism. But I'm not sure I'm willing to go quite as far as your question implies.
Thank you. I will ask Professor Banks and Professor Romero just to take 1 minute because our time is almost up. If you want to add final remarks on the question.
So very briefly, I think the safeguard against protectionism in the rapid response labor mechanism is to devise a fair process so that the issues are clearly identified and properly adjudicated. Whether the change to the footnote, redefining in a manner affecting trade, converts this into something other than a trade agreement, I don't think so myself. I think that change is consistent with a couple of the theories of what trade agreements are doing that I presented earlier.
Thank you, Professor Banks. Hugo?
A quick reaction on one part. I think it won't be the template for RTAs, except for the United States, but we need to remember that was a response to a situation in the North American region that is highly integrated. For example, Chapter 19 of NAFTA or 10 of the USMCA regarding anti-dumping or countervailing duties was not replicated at all in other RTAs. So.
Thank you, Hugo. Well, our time is up, and I would just like to take a quick moment to thank you, all of you, for sharing your interesting views regarding trade and labor. Certainly, it is a topic that we need to continue following very closely. I want to thank you, our audience, for your active participation, and of course, the Geneva Trade Week organizers for making this possible. Thank you all.